Good afternoon, everybody. It's an absolute delight to be able to welcome you here this afternoon. And we're just waiting for a few more people to come in. I can see that there are already over 150 people here. So it's great to have you and to have a fantastic panel for our discussion this afternoon. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. We're really keen that this is an interactive session. I know it can be quite frustrating with webinars that you don't have the opportunity to actually chat to people. It's not the same as sitting in a hall. So please do use the chat to make connections, explain where you've come from, what your interest is, and what you'd like to get out of this afternoon. This is a panel, and we're really keen to take questions. We've had a few in advance, but we're really keen to take questions from people. So please do use the Q&A session. If your question goes into the chat, it won't be seen. So it's really important to use the Q&A sessions, and you'll have the ability to upvote your questions there. So if you like someone else's question, please give it the thumbs up, and then we'll know that that's a question that we'll give more focus to, give more attention to. Excellent. Well, I think the numbers that we've got are settling down, so it's a good chance to start now. And where today's session is something that Rose O'Neill from the Centre for National Parks and myself from the Centre for National Parks and Protected Area, the Campaign for National Parks, and myself from the Centre for National Parks and Protected Areas, we've sort of cooked up, because we do feel that having a clear governance framework, a legislative framework for managing our national landscapes is absolutely critical. And we were going back to the Second World War and thinking about when there was previously major legislation then, the National Parks Act, and thinking, well, do we actually need a new People's Charter? Because that's what it was called at the time, was a People's Charter. And we've got new crises that are facing our country, and in particular, what is the role of our national parks and AONBs in this? We've got the climate crisis, we've got health crises, and we've got the biodiversity crisis. And national parks and AONBs, our national landscapes, cover 24% of England, of the UK. And today our focus is probably particularly going to be on England and Wales, but we're really keen to hear from people from other areas of the United Kingdom or from further afield as well. So we'll all be familiar, I imagine, here with the Glover Review, and we've had the response to the Glover Review from DEFRA, and Wales have been consulting on this as well. And today we're very keen to have with us a representative from the Welsh Government, and we're very we've got Simon Pickering from the Welsh Government here today listening. And we're also hoping that we'll have Sean McGeever as well with us too, and that we know that DEFRA are very keen to hear about what's happening in what around the country. There's been obviously quite a bit of change in government ministers and things over the last few weeks, and we thought it's a bit unfair on civil servants to be responding at this time. But actually this time is so critical. We've got an opportunity to shape the future, and never has it been more critical to think about this. So where in terms of, I hope everybody's got the housekeeping sorted. I can see loads of stuff going on in the chat. Absolutely delighted to see that. So I think we're, well, I'm first going to hand on to Rose for a quick introduction about the Campaign for National Parks, who've been leading organising today. So welcome, Rose, lovely to see you, just back from holiday, all fresh and keen to take on these huge challenges. So tell us a bit about what's behind this and a bit about the Campaign for National Parks work.
Yeah, thanks, Julia, and hello everyone. It's really good to have so many people join us today. This is a hugely important area for Campaign for National Parks. Our first big campaign success was the enactment of the National Parks and Access for the Countryside Act. And it was such a radical piece of legislation, creating the national parks with their purposes of conserving and enhancing wildlife, natural beauty, cultural heritage, and promoting public understanding and enjoyment. As Julia said, it was hailed as the People's Charter for the open air, and it was hugely prescient. So now, over 70 years later, in a world defined by the nature and climate crisis, and also inequality and the pandemic, of course, our nation needs our national parks more than ever. But the powers that were enshrined in that act and the subsequent legislation since have not been enough to keep pace with everything that's come after. They've not been able to keep pace with industrialization, pollution, fragmentation of habitats. And the sad fact is that biodiversity in national parks is a shadow of what it was in 1949. And now, in many cases, it's no better than elsewhere in the countryside. And the powers in that act, while safeguarding the enjoyment of millions of people, have not been sufficient to ensure equality of access and participation. And open access that was so hard fought for and won for working people is now closed off for many, particularly young people and those on low incomes and from minority ethnic backgrounds, and others where there are real hard and soft barriers for getting outside. And so this is why now, right now, we at Campaign for National Parks are campaigning for government in England and Wales to be equally bold and bring forward new legislation. And we welcome their commitments so far in that, an emphasis in both countries for protected landscapes to be right at the heart of efforts to secure international commitments that 30% of our land should be well managed for nature by 2030. But the simple fact is, without much stronger powers for national parks and AONBs, this will be a pipe dream. So first of all, we must secure and defend the legislation we already have. So European legislation like the Habitats Directive has done a huge amount of heavy lifting to conserve wildlife and natural beauty. And the proposals in the retained EU law bill that's going through Westminster right now are as much an attack on these protected landscapes as they are on nature, and they must be scrapped. But second of all, government in England and Wales should take forward the legislative proposals that were set out in their respective independent reviews. So this includes amending the purposes of national parks to place much greater emphasis on nature recovery and on equality. Most importantly, includes strengthening the duty on public bodies to require them to act. And it includes strengthening management plans and requiring accountability to deliver. And we need these changes at the earliest legislative opportunity, which in England is the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, and in Wales is most likely to be in the next Senate Parliament. And we know these immediate changes are really critical, but looking longer term, we know more is needed. You know, we need some big stuff. We need restrictions on damaging land management practices like burning peatland. We need investment frameworks on a statutory footing to ensure enough funding is going in the right places and farmers and land managers are supported, and there's safeguards to ensure we don't get perverse outcomes driven by unregulated markets. So there's, you know, we need lots of bold and radical thinking, and we need to be like those first campaigners. And I really look forward to hearing ideas from the rest of the panel, but also from the audience today in the chat to inform our campaigns at Campaign for National Parks. That's it from me, Julia, as an intro.
Thank you so much, Rose. And I think it is really important that we both look back to the past and look forward to the future. And that's we're really ambitious. Yesterday I was having a discussion with someone, and someone reminded me that despair was one of the sins, not the 7 deadly sins, but there were some additional sins before they limited them to 7, and despair was one of those. So I think we ought to remember that and be positive and optimistic as we look forward. Next, we're going to have a poll where all the participants will be able to introduce themselves. So if we could please run the first poll and just tell us where what role you have, and that'd be really helpful. So hopefully you can see that on the screen. So what's your role? We've got an employee of a National Park or AONB, coming from an NGO, farmer, landowner, from a Friends of group or other. So if you just click on that, then we'll be able to see. Excellent. So interestingly, a lot are other. That's absolutely. So we probably need to do a little bit of a breakdown. If you put other, please do put what your role is and what your interest is in the chat, so we can have a little bit more of a breakdown, because 50% of people either clearly didn't want to be identified as one of the above category. Perhaps they're all lawyers, Ned, and that's the thing. So yes, so I'd now like to just I said earlier about DEFRA and the Welsh Government being here. So first I'd like to introduce Sean McGeever. So if we can just say hi to Sean, who's with us. And if we can just have a quick spotlight on Sean. If
Can you see me? Can you see me?
Oh, there we go. Sean, you're big on you're on the screen now. Lovely that you could join us today, and thank you very much, because I know it's an incredibly busy time in government at the moment.
No, not at all. Should I just introduce myself to those who don't know who I am? So for those who I haven't met, and I can't see who you are because obviously you're out there somewhere, I can see that there's a number of you just from the number on the side. My name's Sean McGeever. I'm the Deputy Director DEFRA, deals with access, landscapes, peatland and soil, but particularly in this case landscapes, and it's my team that is working to advise government on what legislation we might need, or what legislative vehicles we might be able to use to strengthen the purposes and fulfill the recommendations in the Glover Review. So I said I joined today. I mean, all of this is very live, so there's not a huge amount I can say in this forum, other than I think the points that Rose make are valid. I think it's very hard for us to say, hand on heart, that we're gonna do commit to 30 by 30 if we don't make some legislative change, and that's certainly the advice we've been given. It's been tricky because the legislation that we would probably use in the first instance is the Levelling Up Bill, and I think although he was also the first, he's now the fourth Secretary of State at the Levelling Up department in I think as many months. So just trying to get and hold attention has been quite tricky. So we're hoping for a little bit of continuity now, so that we can restart the conversation on getting that legislation in place. But that's about as much as I'll allow myself to say on that, Julia, at this point, if that's all right.
Thank you, Sean. I could just let you talk, and I'm sure we'd then know everything. Well,
it is sometimes like that with me. But what I'm really keen is to hear what's being said today and really understand, what the views are and what people think is necessary, so that we can test that against also some of the advice that we're giving. So I'm very keen to listen with open ears.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we'll let you go back into the background, Sean, and we'll now ask if we can spotlight Simon, please. So Simon, I think your video's off at the moment. Perhaps you can turn your video on. Good afternoon, Simon. Are you on mute, Simon? I know, I can't hear you. No, I'm afraid we can't hear you. We know that Simon's here. I don't know whether our tech people can do anything about that. I think what we might do, Simon, is move on, and then we'll come back to you so that you can say a little bit about the Welsh situation. No, it might be, Simon, if you log out and log back in again, you might find sometimes Zoom is, but I think hopefully you can hear us, can you? Okay. So if we now, so Simon is from from the Welsh Government and is head of landscapes in Wales. And so they're going through a process. There's a Dyfalmath are going through a similar process, and we're really delighted that Simon can join us today. So now what we'd like to do is to bring in the other panelists that we've got with us today. And we've tried to gather today a range of people with a range of skills. They're incredibly eminent, and it's a huge privilege to have them joining us here today. So we're in terms of we've got everybody here, so hopefully we can see everybody there. Well, welcome everybody. Rose has introduced herself. So firstly, I'm going to allow each of the panelists to say a little bit to give themselves an introduction. So I think we'll invite you to give a few 2 or 3 minutes about the topic, if that's all right. So I'm going to, this is a random decision. So firstly, Kate, if you're able to start. And so we're really pleased, Kate, that you've been able to join us. You're RSPB Head of Site Conservation and Species Policies, worked for the RSPB for 13 years and has fell in love with nature as a child, but she's also has a broader remit in being a member of the IUCN Protected Areas Working Group. So Kate, welcome. And if you'd like to give us a little bit of an introduction, then a little bit of your vision for a 21st century People's Charter for Nature Access and Landscape, that'd be brilliant.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julia. Lovely to be here this afternoon and coming to you from the edge of the Yorkshire Dales. So I thought I'd just use my opening remarks to set some context around the imperative for legislative change for our national parks and AONBs from a nature perspective. So we found ourselves in both a nature and a climate crisis, and both the causes and the solutions to those two are inextricably linked. At the global level, last month's WWF Living Planet report found that wildlife populations have on average declined by 69% since 1970. And in the UK, the last State of Nature report found that 41% of UK species have been in decline since 1970. There's no sign of the rates of loss slowing. 15% of UK species are threatened with extinction, and 133 have already been lost. And the Biodiversity Intactness Index of world states shows that the UK is bottom of the pile of the G7 countries in terms of the fraction of its biodiversity that it's got left. Back in 1949, the best places that were to become our national parks and later our AONBs were some of the very best for nature. And their value for nature and the beauty of their landscapes were absolutely a product of their cultural heritage and traditional forms of land management. But sadly, as Rose has already said, that's simply no longer the case. In recent decades, these landscapes have been heavily modified and damaged by a range of increasingly intensive forms of management. And while the data we have is very far from perfect, on a range of measures, it shows that they have failed to buck the trends of the declines in biodiversity that we've seen in the wider countryside beyond their boundaries. And this was a point made clear in the Glover Review. That said, protected landscapes remain home to many of the places with both the highest potential for the recovery of nature and some of our most significant potential natural carbon sinks. In 2021, the Westminster government placed a commitment on the face of the Environment Act to halt the decline in the abundance of species by 2030. And as Rose also mentioned, in the run-up to this December's meeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity, at which global targets to 2030 for nature's recovery will be agreed, the Westminster government has also been part of the global high ambition coalition committing to protect 30% of our land and seas by 2030, that so-called 30 by 30 commitment. Now, if any of those commitments are to have any hope of being met, then our protected landscapes are going to have to punch well above their weight to drive nature's recovery. But as set out in both the government's Nature Recovery Green Paper earlier this year and in IUCN guidance, only those areas which have got a clear purpose of conserving biodiversity, have long-term protection and management in place for nature, and can be shown to be delivering measurable and improving biodiversity outcomes can be counted towards that 30% of land and seas. And quite rightly, based on those criteria, the government has stated its view that under their current statutory purposes, levels of protection and management, our national parks and AONBs cannot be said to contribute towards that 30 by 30 at the current time. We know that more nature in protected landscapes is what the public wants to see. In spring this year, the RSPB commissioned some independent polling. And what that showed was that wildlife is the most valued feature of our national parks and AONBs.
Time up, Kate. Do you want to just finish off?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, there's a really strong public support for more nature in these landscapes, and they're happy to see how those places look change if that's what we need to achieve it. We know there's no lack of ambition for nature in our protected landscapes. Colchester Declaration, National Parks Collective Vision and Priorities, all that make that really clear. Bottom line is the current legal framework around and resources available for the management of these landscapes are simply not adequate to drive and support delivery for nature at the scale that's required. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. No, it was fascinating. I just conscious of time. So I'd now like to introduce Ned Westaway. So Ned is a barrister. He's chair of the UK Environmental Law Association that does all sorts of fantastic work and also goes on trips to different places, to national parks. They don't just stick it, and I've spoken to them in Coniston copper mines of all places once. So I know they get around the country. So he's ranked as a leading junior by Chambers and Partners. He does a lot of very significant cases to do with our national landscapes. And it's a delight to have you with us, Ned, and very much looking at the area around our purposes. So, and he's also the standing counsel for the Campaign for National Parks, so gives of his time very generously to this area. Ned, your take on the People's Charter of the 21st century.
It's a big question. I mean, you asked on legislative changes needed now in particular, but I think it's really interesting to see the People's Charter as a moving picture. So we have the 1949 Act, but it's been bolstered by a series of other acts. So we have 1981, the Wildlife Countryside Act, and we can take that forward to the 2000s because the Countryside Rights of Way Act in 2000 was very significant. And possibly, slightly more controversially, we could add the Marine and Coastal Access Act, 2009, which of course only affects coastal parks and coastal areas, but they're all part of this sort of emerging picture. I think, well, I want to get back to Glover, and I wanted to mention in introductions of 3 areas where I think there's a case for legislative change. First, it's the mismatch between national parks and AONBs. Now, in planning policy terms, I'm very familiar with, because a lot of my work is planning law, AONBs and national parks are treated more or less the same. But the legal underpinning is radically different for them, really. And as Glover recommended, it's not very satisfactory, especially for the larger AONBs. So one of the cases I had that went furthest, ended up in the Supreme Court, was about major development, a sort of whole village, really, of over 600 homes in the Kent Downs AONB just outside Dover. That development would never have been countenanced in a national park. And clearly, across the country, you've got many different local planning authorities, but some of them, driven by some political exigencies or whatever it might be, are not the best custodians of the national interest in protecting AONBs. We did manage to overturn that decision narrowly on reasons, but it was a close-run thing. And I think to increase the national protection in law for AONBs and bring it more, perhaps not the same, but more onto a level of national parks is quite an important thing. Second, and not entirely unrelated, is management plans. Management plans, both for national parks and AONBs, don't have the primacy or the force that they might. And I think they could be, through statutory intervention, made to be more ambitious about the land use and targets included within them, and be made to have more force. Interesting, I asked myself, is legislative change needed for this? I think it is, partly for the same reason, because you've got lots of small authorities at the moment running development plan documents. But Glover noted the approach taken in Arndale and Silverdale AONB, where the two local planning authorities had got together and produced a development plan document to cover the AONB. So there's scope for some improvements within the existing system, I think, for management plans, but generally they don't say as much as they might and don't have the force that they might. Third, and this picks up on a theme that Kate very much champions, is nature recovery, biodiversity enhancement within national parks. I mean, we are letting ourselves down on this. I always think it's interesting. We say the national purposes need to be improved or revamped. They're strong. Conserving and enhancing natural beauty is the primary purpose of national parks. We're just not doing it. So there's the Campaign for National Parks 2018 report on raising the bar, improving nature in our national parks is important. I think there's a case for almost a blanket designation of national parks as part of the Nature Recovery Network. I'm sure this is something we'll come to, but it's interesting. We need to do something. We have a framework. We're not doing it at the moment. What legislative change we do to make the things that are currently not working work, I think, is quite a difficult discussion. The last thing I wanted to say.
You're just running out of time, Ned. If you can just wrap up.
This is the UK Environment Law Association is doing an event on the Environment Act 2021, and I wanted to pop that in the chat because it's for local authorities, and we're covering the biodiversity piece in particular. So I'm popping a link in the chat. That's my publicity piece over. Thank you so much, Julie. Thanks
a lot, Ned. And I think it is really interesting what Ned has there. It's about what's the existing legislation, and this event today is really focused on that governance, that legislation that we require. So when you're thinking of your questions, do you think what are the strengths and weaknesses of the existing legislation, of the existing case law that exists that can be used when cases, if they have to go to court, and then what are the current threats, both to that legislation, as Rose mentioned, with regard to the revocation of European legislation that's potentially ongoing with the sunset clause, but then also what new legislation do we need in order to deliver on the ambitions set out in the Glover Review and the government and support. So do think about that. Can we do better with what we've got? And then what else do we need going forward? So really good to bring us, to remind us of that, Ned. So now I'd like to introduce Tom. So Tom's responsible for he's Director of Advocacy and Operations at the Ramblers, and he's responsible for the charity's campaigning, path protection and walking programmes. And they supporting over 70,000 people to be more active through Ramblers Wellbeing Walks programme. And they're also very focused on saving thousands of miles of historic paths before they're lost. And Tom is also a council member for the National Trust. So Tom, welcome. 3 minutes, please, on the People's Charter, sort of legislative needs. What's the Ramblers looking for?
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Really lovely to be here, and thank you for inviting me and the introduction, Julia. I live in Cambridge now, but I grew up in the Peak District, so I took for granted that I could go outdoors and get out into the countryside at ease, and I think that's not the case for so many people, and that's going to be the theme really of what I'm looking for in terms of the national parks in the future. So I work for the Ramblers today. We're a charity, and our purpose is about giving everyone the freedom to enjoy the benefits of being outdoors. And as a movement, we started in the 1930s, and the original Countryside and Access to the Countryside Act was one of the things that we campaigned on right at the beginning, and are very proud to say as part of our history. And the Act was critical in so many ways, not only because it created national parks and AONBs, but also because it created our wonderful national trails, the first of which was the Pennine Way and was devised by the Ramblers secretary of the time, Tom Stevenson. And right to today, where we're about to open or finish the latest national trail, which is the English Coast Path, which will give everyone access to the whole of the English coastline. And is a huge feat that's been delivered through campaigning from Ramblers and work on the ground from various bodies, including Natural England and others. And the legislation was also really important because it ensured that local authorities had to map and survey the public rights of way network for the first time. Before that, they didn't have to have those records on map, and that meant it was incredibly difficult to protect those public rights of way. And it's been hugely important for the Ramblers and others to keep those paths open, which most of us actually use when we're accessing the countryside. So really important. And I think what made this piece of legislation so vital was that it really understood the connection between nature protection and biodiversity, but also access to nature. And it came about at a period of huge social change coming out of World War II and lots of other things. And it really was seen hand in hand with the National Health Service. We were introducing a National Health Service, but we were also introducing a natural health service. And there was an understanding that access to the outdoors is hugely vital for society's health and well-being. And I think we really need to remember that in terms of what's a radical future we want to see. How is nature being used to improve all of our health and quality of life? So if we fast forward to today, we all know that that crisis around health, nature, climate crisis, they are all connected, and we see that alienation and lack of connectedness to nature is more prevalent than ever. Recently, I'm sure many of you saw the polling or the research that showed England ranks at the bottom of all of European countries in terms of nature connectiveness. And when you look at that alongside the challenges we have around biodiversity and nature conservation, the two in my mind go very much hand in hand. You can't campaign for and protect and appreciate the places you don't experience, enjoy and benefit from yourself. So I think we really need to come up with a program that sees those two things, nature conservation, climate and health, and connected to nature all together. And the other big piece that we're incredibly, Tom, a little bit. I will do. The other piece that we're incredibly interested in and absolutely needs to have further action on is the inequality of access to nature, because we can all see that through the various data and the experiences that we saw through COVID. So 3 things that we'd like to see in legislation. 1, expand the freedoms to roam to more places closer to where people live. 2, a legal right to nature, something we're calling for as part of the Levelling Up and bill. And 3, it doesn't require legislation, but it's absolutely vitally important, access to be at the heart of the public payments for farmers and land managers, the new ELM scheme, something that was promised, but is sadly, therefore, currently lacking in the policy development up to now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. And yes, I'm as a trustee of a care farm and quite dependent on payments under stewardship and encouraging people out into the countryside. I think making sure access, those 6 full baskets of public goods are funded under ELM is absolutely critical, and access for too long has been a poor relation in that regard. So thank you very much. So now I'd like to move on to our last panelist to introduce herself. So Sarah, it's lovely to have you with us. Sarah Mukherjee is the Chief Executive of the Institute for Environment Management and IEMA, and it's really good institute, Environmental Management and Assessment, to give it your full title. Sarah's just got such a depth of knowledge in this area. She sat on the Glover Review. She was a BBC's environment correspondent for many years. She's a non-executive director on the board of the Environment Agency and sat on the National Food Strategy Advisory Panel. Honestly, Sarah, I don't know where you get enough time to do all these things, as well as being a keen fan of Campaign for Real Ale and a rugby supporter. So we're glad to see you've got a good work-life balance, Sarah. Obviously you've been at the heart of this Glover Review. You're really embedded in this. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your vision in terms of a 21st century People's Charter and how legislation, the role of legislation in that.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Julia. And thank you so much to the Campaign for National Parks and the CNPPA for putting this event on. Thank you all for giving up an hour and a half of your Monday evenings to join us as well. You're absolutely right, Julia. I was on the Glover Review, and it was in what's quite a busy and incredibly varied, for which I'm very grateful, career. It was a career highlight because it was a true joy and an honour to not only work with Julian, who was incredibly generous in allowing us to breathe, as it were, through the report, but also to visit and to talk to people in these amazing and beautiful, fragile areas. And I mean, I think our speakers have touched on a lot of the issues I wanted to raise. It did seem when we started incredibly unfair that areas of outstanding natural beauty, and what a mouthful that is in itself, got very little in terms of the attention and money, and yet they were tasked with protecting areas just as popular and diverse in many cases as the national parks. In some cases, indeed, in our experience, parks appeared far more obsessed, or indeed park authority members seemed far more obsessed with local planning or local political issues than with the big picture concerns of climate change, biodiversity and habitat loss, or indeed ensuring these beautiful spaces were available for everyone who was paying for them, which of course is every one of us. And we propose that this often puzzling distinction, as previous speakers have touched on, should be removed, and that all protected landscapes should work within the same organisation with an eye firmly on those big picture prizes. And I feel, it was very disappointing, I'll be honest, that DEFRA, or the DEFRA administration of that particular moment in time, did not share that view. From the conversations that I've had since with people in AONBs and national parks, I'm disappointed that in the absence of direct guidance, tiny steps are being taken voluntarily in linking and developing strategic aims across all protected landscapes when big radical strides are required. And I think this goes to the points that previous speakers have made of whether regulation or legislation is needed to get the change we need to see. I'm sorry, this is going to be a disappointment kind of sharing with you. It's quite cathartic, to be perfectly honest, but disappointed also with the response about the work to increase diversity. We were really clear that the national parks are in danger of becoming a white middle class club, and one of the few people of colour running an organisation in this space, and also chairing a people of colour network across environment and sustainability. I can tell you that something has changed, but on the whole, very little has changed. And as if we've learned anything over the horrors of COVID, it was the importance of access, as Tom was saying, of open space for our mental and physical well-being. But it's not just disadvantaged communities outside national parks. To a certain extent, people like Horun Mehta in Muslim Hikers, Desi Ramblers, Black Girls Walking, they've all worked really hard and stupendously to fill that gap. But it's also white working class communities that are in the parks themselves, for whom the parks have absolutely no relevance. And again, I think it's fair to say that in some cases, not all, but in some, parks have simply failed in an obligation, I would put it, to support communities within their own boundaries to get to those access to nature. And the point is about the organisations I've just mentioned, is that they haven't waited for anybody else to give leadership. They've taken it because, and let's face it, the reason they've done so is that they have not waited for leadership or regulation, because that leadership or regulation is currently absent. And finally, I would make the case for one recommendation that we made, which is particularly close to my heart, and that is every child should spend a night under the stars in a protected landscape. And if I was going to legislate for anything, it would be for that. At a time when there's so much worry in so many households, the unconfined joy, the sense of freedom, and the ability to understand each other a little better that this recommendation could bring, I think, is incomparable. As Rose alluded to, this is a movement with its roots in the urban immigrant communities in Manchester who went to jail for the right to roam. And who knows what future defender of protected landscapes we are missing with current lack of access to our fabulous protected landscapes. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's fantastic to hear your passion and remind us, all the panelists today have reminded us how critical it is. And the very fact that these parks and protected areas, and I'll use the national landscapes term, I think if we say both national parks and AONBs, it's very long. So if everyone's comfortable when I say national landscapes, we're talking about both AONBs and national parks. And I think it's important with AONBs to remember that often they're so much closer to areas of population as well. So it's absolutely critical. I know there are national parks nearby. We've got quite a lot of questions that have come in, and some of them are covering similar areas. So I'd like to sort of get on with some of the questions, and we've and take a range, cover a range of things. So if yours doesn't get chosen, I'm hoping that the topic will get chosen. So I'm going to start with one that's had Anushka Rawdon has asked 2 questions. I'm actually going to start with her shorter question, which hasn't had as many upvotes, but it's a shorter question. It may be easier for the panelists to remember. So and with this, so the question is how can national park planning authorities work harder to deliver inclusive design and connectivity with a particular focus on underrepresented users of protected landscapes? So hopefully everyone, I don't know, it was a question that appeared at 1635, if you can see that. And so how can national park, I'm going to say here, I'm going to actually make this as national landscape. So we'd like this to cover both. So I know it's the planning authority, but I think if we can look at both of them, work harder to deliver inclusive design and connectivity. Now, if you'd like to think about whether we need legislative change here, if we're not getting it already, then that would be great. So I'd like to start first by asking Tom whether you could address this question.
Hi, yeah, well, I'll give it a go. 2 things come to mind. One, I think there is something around the purpose. I get Ned's point that the purposes are actually quite strong, but I think the purposes could be strengthened to put that inclusivity and that access to every section of society right at their heart. And that goes for national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty, which don't really have that purpose around access and enjoyment of the environment. So that's one thing. I think the second thing that just popped into my head is on practical actions, is making sure that the path network is open and accessible as possible. And we're very soon going to be able to release some research we've been doing with the New Economics Foundation, really looking at who is served by the path network and what are the barriers to people using it. And there are some really great programs like Miles Without Styles or Paths for Wellbeing, which is a program we're running in Wales, which is really working with communities to remove some of the very practical barriers that stop disabled people using the path network. So there's some really good programs out there that are removing physical barriers, but I'd also suggest a change in the purpose as 2 ideas. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Tom. If we, Sarah, would you like to add? I know you've said, but would you like to add anything more on this?
Yes, a great question, and goes to the heart of what a lot of the conversation has been about thus far. I mean, I would say go and talk to the communities you want to engage with. I mean, faith networks is a really good way of engaging. A lot of faiths, non-Christian faiths as well, have nature at the heart of their faith precepts and are very open. I mean, it's my experience, very open to having this conversation. But just find out, each community will be different. Find out what they need and what they want from you, and how access could be made more easy. It's not actually rocket science. It's just what that rather terrible phrase, stakeholder engagement, but also within your own national parks. If there was one park that found about 1% of the children actually within the park itself were using the natural landscapes like beaches and that sort of thing, because they just didn't see it was relevant. Well, how would it become relevant for them? So the more conversations you can have, the easier the engagement becomes.
Fantastic. Ned?
Well, I suppose it's less a question for me as a lawyer, but I mean, I do think the Equality Act 2010 has a role here. I think equality impact assessments, it's odd, they get used in some areas of administrative law very, very commonly, and they mean very little. And in some areas, they're not used at all. And it's an open goal, potentially for legal challenge. But with access, they should be perhaps given more of a role. I could see there being equality impact assessments. So this is how one implements the public sector equality duty, being given a more substantive role when authorities are looking at access questions. And some of those might be conclusions that aren't necessarily that easy, such as, you know, make car parks easier to use or bigger, or put sometimes it's going to cut against some of the other things that we hold on to, but perhaps make national parks a bit less exclusive. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know others' thoughts on how equality impact assessments can be used and are being used.
Thank you. No, that's and now Kate.
Take myself off mute. I guess little to add here really, other than to highlight there's some massive win-wins here around connectivity and access, and the actions that we also need to take in the area of climate change. So you know, we know that, you know, it was said earlier, while AONBs are often nearer to big centres of population, national parks are often quite a long way away. We know there are huge issues around public transport. We know there are huge issues also around cost of using that public transport. So we've talked a bit about, you know, connectivity and access within the landscapes, but how about connectivity to centres of population and access from outside those places? So I'm just very mindful that there are win-wins there where we can make progress on both fronts. Thank you very much. Yes, I know if Elaine King from the Chilterns was here, she would remind us that hers is the AONB, the only one that can get to, I think, Fry the Tube. So, you know, public transport it's quite interesting how many can people actually get to on the metro or the tube. So yes, Rose, do you want to add anything on this one?
Yeah, I was just going to say some of the amendments that we'd like to see in England and Wales immediately following the Glover and Marsden review relate to this. So Tom's already mentioned the change in purposes, and we think that's really, really important actually. So at the moment, there isn't a statutory requirement to do anything on it, you know, on this, by the Equality Act that Ned mentioned, of course. But, you know, we know from our experience with running the Mosaic programme, a campaign for national parks with national park authorities for many years, you know, as soon as the project lottery funding ran out, that just was sort of went away. And so there's something about making sure that that is a top priority through the purposes. And then there's some of the other amendments. So, for example, we'd like to see new powers on public bodies to do more. So that would speak to Kate's point about the Transport Authority. We need requirements on the Transport Authorities to put in place public transport for access. Management plans, again, really, really important. You know, we need to have them to have an accountability and a statutory footing and framework. So when an authority sets out in its management plan, co-designed, as Sarah said, with communities what it needs to do, that it's actually held accountable for delivering that, and, you know, all the way up to potentially being able to do a complaint to the Office of Environmental Protection because it's not delivering on its management plan. So there's something there, I think, more broad, you know, there's a broader set of just strengthening that, which actually could really bear weight on this issue in particular as well.
So we'll say is as important as having a bus that goes to the hospital as having a bus that goes to one of the national landscapes. Fantastic, thank you very much. I'm now going to go to a sort of question that's linked to this. It's one from Rachel Thompson, and it's looking at paths and looking at the sort of win-wins that Kate's already referred to. So I'll read it out, and just for those who, the panelists, it came in at 1610. It's number 2 on the questions. So permanent, connected, accessible, welcoming and well-signed green infrastructure networks comprised of rights-of-way, quiet lanes and other routes are crucial. Public access networks married up with biodiversity improvements and nature recovery plans could be provided through agricultural schemes under ELM. And this has been raised already by Tom. What action is being taken to create, upgrade and improve these crucial networks through incentivizing landowners and land managers? So this is, in a sense, for those who don't know what ELM is, it's environmental land management, and it's the government sort of replacement for the common agricultural policy. And it's a way of paying people who own or manage land. They may be tenants, they may be landowners, they may be owner-occupiers, they may be commoners. How can they have a contract to deliver public goods? And one of those public goods is access, and biodiversity is another. So this is effectively a contract, so it's not legislation, but it is a really important contract that farmers can enter into. We've had quite a lot of other questions about the role of private owners, so maybe when you're answering this question, panel, you could think about the role of private ownership within our national landscapes here. So I'm going to ask Ned if you'd like to start us off here, Ned, and whether you'd be able to just have a think about whether there are any options here.
I mean, this national parks are private land, and that's one of the fundamental tensions, in how we might think of national parks, is that the land is overwhelmingly private. There may be national nature reserves, there of course will be footpaths, and we'll have open access areas in national parks, especially some of the more elevated national parks. There'll be a lot of that. I don't know, I mean, in terms of action, and I remember I don't know how long ago it was, the Cycling UK campaign, which was, I think they called it Get On My Land. And the idea was to try to get through to landowners that the public on your land is not actually the problem that you might see it as. And it is amazing when I obviously act for various interests and sometimes for landowners, how there's this almost automatic hostility to the public. So I would hope that through some positive campaigning, we could break through that sort of wall of instant hostility. I don't think it's likely that we're going to be able to break through the private ownership of national parks. So I think we need to do it through a contractual, consensual way. It's not realistic that it's going to be achieved in another way at this stage, at least.
Thank you. Yes, I don't think we're not suggesting a nationalisation here at this point. Kate.
Would help if I always remember to unmute myself, wouldn't it? Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things to say on this. So, I mean, the first critical thing to say at this point in time right now is that whole promise of public money for public goods is currently a wee bit up in the air. So the most obvious, arguably the only kind of clear Brexit benefit from an environmental point of view was to move away from the cap-based system of payments to farmers based on the area, largely on the area of land they farm, regardless of how they farm or what they farm, and a move to payment of public money for public goods. That includes access, that includes nature, that includes clean air and water and flood mitigation and a whole range of other things. So there's currently, we are told, a review of that ELM proposal that's happening right now. Results of that's likely to be imminent. So I mean, it's vitally important that fundamental premise that public money is paid for public goods is held on to, and that's going to be essential in delivering access, nature, and all of those wider benefits. I think there's been an important role played by the Farming and Protected Landscapes funding pot, which has been there to support the transition for farmers in our protected landscapes. That's done some good things for nature and for access. I think there are some things around kind of accountability and scrutiny and clear objectives for how that money's spent. But I think on the whole, that's been seen as a good thing across the piece and has delivered across the access and nature agendas. And then on the private ownership point, I mean, I think I'd say two things. I think there's a real imperative around curbing some of the worst excesses of damaging land management practice everywhere, but particularly in our protected landscapes. So burning over peat, for example, in a nature and climate context, which is now restricted, but far from ruled out. Those kind of controls, we need to think really hard about that. But I agree that the bulk of how we deal with private land managers has got to be around incentives, and again, the higher tiers of that environmental land management scheme are going to be really important in terms of delivering both access and nature at the scale we need across these places.
Thank you, Kate. And we've got lots of questions coming in, so I'm just going to go to to a couple of people here. Tom, would you like to say anything about this?
Yes, I would. Thank you for the question, Rachel. I mean, you probably won't be surprised. I agree completely with what you're saying and what's been said by the panel. You know, we campaigned really hard to make sure that access was included as one of the public goods as part of the Agricultural Act. And we've had, you know, more than several conversations with government and officials and ministers of various ministers over the time since, and we've often been told that access will build elms and the public payments, but we've seen almost nothing to demonstrate that that's actually the case. And I think with elms being up in the air, even if it is brought back, we think there's a real risk that access is really not in any meaningful way, you know, beyond farm Sundays, which are great, but they're not a public good. We think there's a real danger that elms is really doesn't consider access at all, which would be a huge shame given how important our path network in particular. You know, there's some really practical things that we've put forward to the government that they could do and that farm land managers would welcome. We've spoken to NFU and CLA and others about some of the things that farm managers would really welcome support with. And that's something we'll continue to campaign on and would like to see brought forward. So yes, join the Ramblers campaign if you want to see access as part of the elms piece.
Brilliant, thank you. And I know that lots of organisations, you've got the, in a sense, the encouraging elms to go forward. There's the Attack on Nature that people will be well aware of. I'm sure the campaign of National RSPB, National Trust, Wildlife Trust and others, CPRE and others. So yes, I'm now going to move us on to another question, which is sort of going back towards the purposes and sort of the balancing and that creative tension. We talk about win-wins a lot, but it's not always about a win-win. And I'm going to turn to David Gosling's question, which was at 1648. And we've had quite a few questions that have been about this. So, you know, the 20 million people coming to the Lake District and others, you know, that tension. So if we can... David's question is short and snappy. Thank you, David. How can we balance conflicts between protecting biodiversity and increasing public access? And what's the role of legislation here? Sarah, I'll come to you first on this one, if that's all right.
Yes, thank you. And obviously it's something that we had quite long discussions and involved discussions on the review panel about. I think it's without wishing to kind of categorize people or box what people want to do in, I think there is space in national parks for both. And that's down to careful and considered planning. But for the vast majority of people, I think Northumberland National Park did a really good kind of flow diagram to show from its main centre how far people went, and the majority of people went about 300 or 400 meters beyond the visitor centre itself, and you know, it's vanishingly small by the time you even got a kilometre or two out beyond that. Most people who do not regularly go to national parks do not want to go for a 10-mile hike in the middle of the countryside. They want to enjoy the countryside, they want to enjoy the facilities and have a nice day out. And so it is not beyond the wit of man to be able to find a way of accommodating both increased access, making sure, to Tom's point, that it's accessible if you've got different disabilities, different physical needs, if you've got different family needs, if you're, you know, a young mum on your own who just wants to have a bit of peace and quiet and a bit of tranquility, and also to make sure that the national parks meet their incredibly important biodiversity and nature goals. And that's kind of the point of having people working at the national park, to be perfectly honest. You know, it's not a surprise that people want to come and that we need to support nature and wildlife. And so I would suggest that could be, you know, should be fairly fundamental to what we see. But in many national parks, as we've already discussed, it's just got very unbalanced. And a lot of time, and I speak as someone who did sit on a national park, a lot of time is spent banging on about Mrs. Scroggins' conservatory and not really thinking about where, you know, where we're going to be in 50 years' time with an increasingly denuded landscape, or the fact that someone might turn around and say, well, what are we spending all this money on national parks for? Because it's only a certain very small demographic that can get there even, let alone enjoy it.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll now ask Ned whether you feel, you know, in terms of changes in purposes and things, whether that will be helpful, or whether actually we have enough legislative powers and we're just not using them.
I think there's scope to use what we've got better. I think what Sarah was just talking about in terms of what national park authorities are doing, it's often very reactive to developments, sometimes quite small developments, but things that happen. And one of the bits I found very interesting in the review was when it does a sort of overview as a table of what the management councils of national parks have actually been looking at their last meetings. And it's all planning stuff. It's planning projects that the agenda of which is led by landowners proposing things in national parks. And I think what could be done more is that national parks could try and take the lead to actually initiate what they want to see as positive change, rather than responding to what they see as negative change and trying to make sure it's not so negative. So I think there's scope to do a lot more. I don't want to say that the purposes couldn't be improved. I just want to say that they're quite good already, and they're quite strong, subject to the point about the AONBs being out of sync. I mean, I think AONBs clearly are out of sync and need to be sort of updated. But the purposes of national parks are quite good. I also take the point about access. And this tension is always going to be a tension between humans and nature. And getting it right is always going to be, I think, one of the great challenges for land managers. You know, we need people who are connected to nature in order to protect nature and give it the value that it needs in society. So these will be win-wins, but I think they're sometimes difficult win-wins or convoluted win-wins.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. I think it's that governance. It's a rules-based system, but it's doing that. I mean, one thing I worked a lot in Indonesia and the Philippines I wrote national park management plans for parks in the Philippines, and it's very different there because actually you have a land use framework, and that's something that we don't really have, where, as you say, reactive rather than proactive. Partly that's because the land is privately owned, but it's really, perhaps we can take the best of both and you know, work with that. I know that parks have management plans, but it's seen as a bit perhaps perhaps committees are worried about seen as nationalising private land, and that's why we don't have proactive, you know, planning around that. So yeah, lots to think about there. Rose, did you want to say anything on this one, and before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I just add that I think we've learned a huge amount through the pandemic, actually, and the authorities have learned a huge amount reacting into crisis. But I think actually this is a lot about, it's a management problem. And so if we can learn from that in terms of thinking about how do we make sure that the national park authorities and the AONBs can manage this problem? How can we help them and support them to set out plans that are actually, you know, to manage it? And that's one of the reasons that we want, you know, that stronger accountability framework through the management plan. So we'd really like to see those management plans as tools to think about how to be, you know, proactive rather than sort of reflecting on stuff that's already being done.
No, thank you, Rose. I'm now going to stick with this area of tension, and particularly around purposes of our national landscapes. And this is a question that we've received in advance from John Mills from the Cotswolds. And it says, does the aspiration to achieve net zero override protected landscape considerations? For example, should we allow or support or plan positively even for renewable energy development, even if the scale and type of the development would harm the natural beauty of the protected landscape? Similarly for woodland creation schemes. So that's that balancing of climate and the role of 24% of the country is, you know, is that something that we should be adjusting our aspirations for? So that's climate sort of versus natural beauty. And I'm going to come to Kate first on this one. Kate.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess for me, our protected landscapes are such an obvious place where there are win-wins that you don't have to make compromises around. We'll come to the compromises in a minute, but we did some mapping a little while ago, and we looked at the places with the highest potential for biodiversity across the UK, and we looked at the places with the highest potential for natural sequestration of carbon. And the first thing to say is that they basically overlap, and the second thing to say is they look a lot like the map of the protected landscapes. So in terms, and I guess the other thing I'd say around that is that getting a lot of those habitats, particularly estuarine and upland peat habitats, into really good nick is fundamental, because they should be some of our biggest carbon sinks. And right now, the uplands particularly one of our biggest carbon sources. And so doing a lot of the other stuff around trees, and I think there's a statistic that if you don't get our peat bogs into decent nick, they will emit more than the total amount of carbon that would be sequestered if we managed to hit our tree planting targets. So there's a thing about being really clear about you know, where are the places where there are obvious actions that focus on improving current habitats, because that has the greatest potential. I think tree planting is interesting because tree planting is an easy thing to write targets around, and it's an easy thing to measure if you do it. So there's a big rush for trees, but I think done sensitively, I think there is a clear path through that. So our protected landscapes have lost an awful lot of their trees. There's an awful lot less trees about in those places than there used to be. And I think if we think carefully about where we put those trees, they can deliver carbon and landscape and nature benefits. But there is a real risk in it, in a kind of perverse dash for any old tree in any old place. Yeah, that's probably enough from me, is it?
Thanks very much, Kate. Kate, that's great, and I'm sure people will have seen the press around Guy Shrubsole's book on the, you know, our temperate rainforest. And as I drove down, you know, through, you know, into Langdale, through the Central Lakes, and, you know, in areas such as Borrowdale, we know that there are remnants, fantastic areas, and some quite large areas. So there is this shifting baseline, isn't it, about our expectation of what our national landscapes look like. So Tom, I wonder whether you have a view on this. Clearly you're representing, you know, huge numbers of people who go and enjoy, the millions and millions who enjoy these national landscapes. How do they feel about the landscape character and how we balance this?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer much more than Kate said. You know, obviously lots of the people that enjoy getting outdoors and enjoying the countryside are people that also care about that nature being protected, and those landscapes and those views and the biodiversity and all those things. They're all champions. They're a movement of people who care about nature and therefore want to experience and benefit from it. And you know, there's not a simple answer. You know, if you put, is it wind farms or nature loss, it's not an argument you can win, really. You know, we just need to use the data, which Kate has, you know, far more knowledge than I. You know, some of those data she's given examples to. Use the data, join up our plans, so we're not planting trees in one place without thinking about the impact that might have on carbon and climate elsewhere. And it seems to me that if we can't do that in our protected landscapes and our areas of outstanding natural beauty, then where can we do it? So these should be exemplars of where those compromises can be delivered. I think that's probably all I could say on it.
Great, thank you. And now what's interesting is that we've come up time again that we have opportunities with the current legislative framework. We don't seem to have, for whatever reason, we're not actually doing it as well as we could anyway. And what do we need to make this better? And so I'd like to now turn to Jane Wright's question. So this was at 1629, and so quite near the top, it's got 10 up votes. And Jane has said, if we are not implementing the purposes of national parks, do we need to reconsider National Park Committee membership and hold them more accountable? And I can see Sarah nodding there, having the review having eloquently addressed this point. So Sarah, I might come to you first on this, if that's all right.
Sure. Yes, in a word, yes. This, as the review and the report from the review made abundantly clear, we spent a lot of time talking about governance and how really we need something a lot more streamlined. I mean, we would have suggested smaller boards, perhaps something a bit more strategic with some boards. And to be perfectly honest, if you talk to national park staff teams, they're completely off the record, then they would agree that it is very difficult. As we all know, we all sit on boards. The bigger the board, the more difficult it is to keep it focused, particularly on those big strategic issues. I mean, some of these beautiful, fragile, protected landscapes are going to look totally different in even 20 or 30 years' time because of the climate emergency. And this is the last thing often that gets addressed. And so, yes, I mean, greater accountability and a far more strategic plan. You know, a board should be there to deliver a strategic overview of an organisation. You know, where's the strategic plan? Where are the KPIs? And what's more, you know, who's going to be marking the homework? And I think we need far greater focus on how we assess delivery from national park boards. Totally agree.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Ned.
Thanks, Julia. I haven't got a lot to add to that. I mean, I don't have the practical experience that many watching and other panelists would have of boards, but I do find it surprising how dysfunctional they often seem to be when I have come up and had to look at decisions made by the national park boards. And they don't have the same excuse that local authorities have of democratic element. That clearly there's a sort of indirect democratic representation on boards, but they could be designed so much better. They could work so much better, and I think they really should. So it's going hand in hand with greater ambition, perhaps targets, and for national parks should be boards that are competent to actually deliver that and take it forward. And I'm sure some of the things that Sarah said are really wise and probably can be done just by shaking things up.
If we're not having that, do you think we need legislation that actually changes the format of boards so that becomes an obligation rather than, you know, nice to have?
Yeah, well, it might require some legislative tweaking because, of course, the makeup of boards is specified in statute at the moment. I haven't thought specifically about how one would do that, but this is not major legislative change, just to slightly change the way that the boards work, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, okay. Rose, I'm going to ask, I know that CMP is doing quite a lot, you know, thinking about amendments, and have you turned your thoughts to this?
Yeah, we think that we need amendments to this. So I agree with Ned. I think that, I mean, one of the things that was quite interesting when the Environment Act was passed last year with the new Office of Environmental Protection, you know, we looked at it and said, could we ever take a complaint to them about national parks and AONBs? And just no, there just wasn't enough hooks in the legislative framework we've got to have any kind of accountability for delivery. So we would want to see, like Sarah and Ned talked about, the changes in terms of governance changes, those tweaks to governance, but also accountability strengthened across the board. So, you know, we need to have accountability to make sure that, you know, Forestry Commission isn't planting the wrong tree in the wrong place. You know, there needs to be water companies, plans reflect the national park purposes. So there needs to be much stronger accountability mechanism across all of those public bodies and statutory agencies. There needs to be Natural England and Natural Resources Wales. We want to see much stronger accountability role for them. We'd like to see them having a role where they are not just interested in the designation of national parks and AONBs, which seems to be the case at the moment, but actually in the managing of it and making sure that these assets are recovering and are delivering what we need for a nation, and someone needs to ensure that. And we'd like to see it have a sort of golden thread all the way up to, you know, Welsh ministers and Secretary of State, and up to the Office of Environmental Protection. So, you know, why shouldn't management plans have a statutory underpinning So the Secretary of State and the Welsh Minister is actually responsible for making sure these deliver across the piece, because actually, as someone said in the chat, a lot of the time it's a funding challenge, an implementation challenge with legislation. So someone needs to be really responsible at a much higher level, at a national level in England and Wales, to make sure all of this is delivered as well. So it's accountability, yes, but across the piece.
Yeah, thank you very much. And time's moving on apace. It always goes very quickly, doesn't it? So I particularly now like to, we had quite a lot of questions around private land ownership, and I know we've touched on that quite a lot. And I've been trying to sort of look at the various questions that have been coming through. And I think I'm going to ask one. They didn't say who they are. They put the question in advance, and it says, private land ownership means positive change almost always requires financial incentives for landowners, managers to make differences that benefit nature. Does this mean we are doomed to fail nature in Britain, as positive change so rarely happens because it's just the right thing to do? That's you know, I think maybe when panel, you'll have looked at the other questions around private ownership as well. We've had talk about ELM and things, but should we be seeing this 24% of England as really a place for nature, and what does that mean in terms of private land ownership and obligations? As you know, with rights come responsibilities, but if you could think about that in the broadest possible context. I realise it's quite a controversial question, so I'll just repeat the final part of the question. Does this mean we are doomed to fail nature in Britain, as positive change so rarely happens? So I'm going to turn now to Kate on this one.
Okay. So I'm not sure we're doomed to fail. So positive change does often require financial incentives, but as we said earlier, we are hoping to move from a situation in which the bulk of the financial incentives are paid based on how much land somebody has rather than on what they do with it. So the first big shift that should give us hope, if indeed government doesn't roll back on it, is the idea that the money that is given to private landowners will be for delivering public goods, not to reward them from owning a load of land. So that is our first thing. I also referred earlier to the need, you know, to really think quite hard about some of the constraints on some of the excesses of intensive management that maybe should be applied across the piece as restrictions. The other thing I'd say is that there's a strong and growing movement of land managers who are doing the right thing because it turns out it's actually helping their bottom line. So within the Nature Friendly Farming Network, representing an awful lot of farmers, I mean, across the UK, but a high percentage within protected landscapes, who are beginning to recognise that in some of our agriculturally more marginal land, anything but marginal from a nature point of view, the intensification of land management, while it has increased income, has reduced profit, and that more regenerative approaches to farming actually deliver a greater profit margin and better mental health and a better quality of life and loads more nature. So the two things there that give me hope are, one, if we only pay people to do the good stuff, and two, that a lot of people are finding that doing the good stuff pays them better anyway.
Enlightened self-interest.
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm going to ask Tom to do this, and then we're going to take one last question. I'm going to try and sneak in. So, Tom.
Thank you, Julia. No, I don't think we're doomed to fail. I hope not anyway. I guess a couple of things that come to mind, building also on what Kate said. You know, I've already mentioned elms. That's an opportunity if we take advantage of it. I think it's also important to remember our public rights of way network is a public highway, like a road, and land managers have a legal duty to keep those clear. So, you know, people can use those networks, and the challenge really is around local authorities having the budgets and the resource to keep those paths clear. You know, The other thing that we would certainly like to see is an extension to the right to roam, the freedom to roam, something we have on 8% of England, but far more extensively in Scotland. And we think that would, whilst we have it in mountains, moorlands, heathlands, why not extend that to places close to where people live and could benefit from it. And I think that would be a real change in terms of answering lots of the questions we've had around focus in one or two locations, some of the challenges we've managed there. And certainly I think national landscapes, again, could be places where public access is an exemplar and we could see more open access managed in a good way.
So that ties in with the Caroline Lucas's bill, isn't it? That's and that the what's being put forward around that. So that's really good to hear. I'm going to go to our last question now, and I think it goes back to what really picking up from the original People's Charter and then looking at the new People's Charter. So we know particularly around, we were talking about the original People's Charter coming out of lack of access to the countryside for working class people, particularly in the north of England. I will unashamedly speaking from Cumbria, and the north of England for me starts at Shap, so I'm quite restricted on this. Manchester's pretty much in the south, but anyway, well, but there's a good question here that was at 505 from Maxwell Iamba, who asked another question. This is a nice, short, really good question. I think it really sums up that if we look at that our national landscapes are for the nation, and then we look about, if we were to look at the nation, only 4.8% of professionals identify as BME compared to 12.64% across all UK. So the question is can we use our national landscapes and particularly using the green social prescribing, and I'd also say initiatives such as National Nature Service and other such initiatives, can we proactively ensure that we can address these inequalities in the society? Sorry, Maxwell, for adding to your question. But yes, so should we be doing more and effectively using our funding and legislate to make sure the money goes to address these inequalities and issues of social justice? I'm going to first ask Sarah to address this.
Thanks, Julia, and I'll be really quick because I know that we've got lots of panellists who want to get in as well. But first of all, hi, Maxwell, brilliant question as always. Yes. Wouldn't it be nice, though, if we didn't have to be talking constantly about legislation to get some national park authorities to do the right thing? Could they not just perhaps do that because it's the right thing without having to be pushed in the back the whole time? Maxwell's actual point was around the shocking diversity or cliff between the number of BAME professionals and the number in the UK population. And I think that speaks to a very, very, again, there is we run a people of colour network within IEMA, doing things like putting DSI on the risk register. So every time you have a conversation at board level, you have a conversation about that, reaching out to communities, providing apprenticeships, making sure that you make every possible effort to reflect the community that you're serving. This is not rocket science. Other organisations are doing it and doing it really successfully. So why aren't national parks? Because not in all cases, but in some cases, it's just there are other priorities. But I totally agree. We shouldn't need legislation to do the right thing. We need parks that are set up in the right way to do it without being told.
Thank you very much. Ned, is there a role for legislation here, or how do we address this gap?
I mean, it's a gap that's reflected elsewhere. I mean, land managers, farmers, lawyers are really bad on representation. Environment law, which is where I work, is incredibly bad. There's confluence, because there are areas of law that have better representation. But if you're talking about land, environmental law, even public law more generally, I think we have the legal frameworks. I think this is a cultural problem primarily, and I think we need to be much more open to different ways of thinking. Certainly we've had long discussions about this within the UK Environment Law Association, and it's not easy. but we come back to, well, in everything we do, we need to be thinking about this. We need to be open-minded, and we need to try to think, well, how does it seem from the outside as well as how does it seem from the inside? But yeah, it's always healthy to be reminded of these issues. These are national parks, they're for the nation, and I think the whole national interest should be reflected in them. Thank
you very much. Kate?
Currently under siege from trick-or-treaters, so I apologise if the doorbell goes or the knocker. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna double back to the governance question on this one, because I'm not sure. As Sarah says, I'm not sure legislation could or should be needed here. When we think about the people who run and oversee the running of our protected landscapes, those groups of people need to look like the diverse communities that these places need to serve. So, and I absolutely think we need legislation to change that, to ensure that we have both that the full representation of areas of expertise across the purposes of landscapes, and communities who look like those they are meant to represent. You know, too many of our National Park and AONB boards are old, male, pale and stale, and that's, you know, that is changing a little bit, but it's got to change an awful lot more.
Thank you very much. Tom?
Yeah, I think I agree. It's more, in my view, more cultural than legislation that's needed. Although I completely, we've talked about the purpose and how that might help, and completely agree also around the governance. I think Ned picked up a really important point, that this is industries beyond the national park an issue with them. You know, the environment sector, the conservation sector that a couple of us are on, including the Ramblers, institutions like the Ramblers. How do we, who are part of the status quo, move in a way that's helping move the whole shift and the whole culture, and giving a greater voice, or sharing a greater voice and resource and powers with a more diverse range of groups. So, you know, this is one that I think we need to call on the national parks to take action, but we also need to take ownership of some of that and think about what are we and RSPB and Campaign for National Parks and all of us doing to change that culture that exists around all these institutions that are working together.
Thank you very much. I'm now a couple of minutes behind time, so if it's all right, we're going to ask Rose to give a few sort of closing comments, and we'll draw together, and we've got one more poll. So I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all the questions, and we will gather all these and look at them afterwards as well. But it's been wonderful to have your feedback. So Rose, would you like to sort of provide any closing remarks here?
Thank you, and thank you everyone. And I think I'd like to go back to what Ned said right at the beginning about this being a continuum. Actually, about we had this, you know, People's Charter back in the 30s, recognising historic inequalities and needing to give, you know, people the rights to the open air. And since then, we've had lots of changes in legislation, and this is a continuum. And we've had really good discussions this evening about what the next step could be. So that's really exciting. And I know we've had a lot of comments, actually, and a lot of questions. And what we will do is take those away and think about those, and do come to us, because over the next, you know, this is a really important area of debate. It's hugely timely. There's a lot of thinking going on in governments in England and in Wales and you know, Scotland and elsewhere. And so one of the things, so we're having lots of conversations, we're drafting amendments, we're speaking to parliamentarians, raising this with ministers over the coming weeks for national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty as well. So it's very live, and even, you know, when we started promoting this webinar back in September, the situation has moved drastically, so it's changing all the time. But what we will do is keep, you know, we'll take your ideas and questions, keep them coming in, and hopefully we can keep having a dynamic conversation about what the, you know, the future legislation needs to be. So yeah, you're welcome to get in touch with us directly for our team, and through social media. We're an independent charity. We receive no funding from government. That's one of the reasons we are able to strongly campaign. So do consider joining us as a friend of national parks as well. Our friends of national parks are needed more than ever, I think, at the moment. So the last thing I would just like to say, thank you to Julia for hosting this, and for all of the team for supporting it, and for our panelists as well. So thank you so much for joining this. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much, Rose. And we've got one final poll. As I say, the event has been recorded, and we will be able, you'll be able to find it on YouTube, our YouTube channel for CNP and CNPPA. And so if people weren't able to join tonight, then please point them in the direction of this, and we'll have that available. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to our speakers. It's been an absolute pleasure. Kate from RSBB, Ned Westaway, barrister, Tom from the Ramblers, Sarah with her multiple hats, and of course Rose as well from CNP. So it's been great to have you with us. We're 1 minute over time. I think if we're just people quickly answer the question. So this is what new areas of legislation are most important to act right now. So we'll just give people a moment, and then our tech team will close the poll. And thank you very much for your time today, everybody, for attending, for all the questions and the breadth of questions. And what amazed me is the overlap between these and the interconnection. And I think that's what we really need to focus on. So here we go. So the areas of so amended national parks purposes, 25%, duties on public bodies that obligate action, 55%, new purposes and stronger powers for AONBs, 67%, expanded right to roam, 38%, and yeah, greater powers for National Park Authority. So that's a really good range of things. So Ned, I think you repeatedly talking about the AONBs, obviously that struck home, but really good questions there. And how do we deliver change? That's what today's been really about. How do we deliver change? On that note, where it's lovely to see the optimism, wish you all a good evening, and thank you very much for your attendance this evening. So I'll close the webinar, and thank you very much.
Thank you, bye.